You're watching Cybersecurity Inside, a videocast where you can discover what you need to know about cybersecurity. Here are your hosts, Tom Garrison and Camille Morhardt.
Our guest today is Ollie Whitehouse. He is a group CTO for NCC Group, responsible for group technical strategy, product management, and R&D functions. He has over 25 years of experience in information and cybersecurity, working in consultancy and applied research and engineering. So welcome to the podcast, Ollie.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
For those of you through the magic of editing, you missed the fact that I had to go like 5 times through that introduction just to get Ollie's intro out. But it's great to have you. So Ollie, can you just walk through a little bit? I just touched on your background, but maybe a little bit more detail about what it is that you do and what you've done over your career.
So I've been very fortunate in that I have had 25 years in cyber, birth of an industry, some might argue. Mine started in the 90s during the dot-com boom. We identified that we could make more money breaking into networks legally than building them. And so had a terrible amount of fun during that period. And I latterly went on and worked in applied research for the likes of BlackBerry and Symantec, really understanding and identifying flaws in technology software level. And then latterly joined NCC Group, which is a UK headquartered but a multinational cybersecurity services firm, working for the largest technology and wider companies on the planet, helping them protect their estates and their technology.
Well, the focus for today on today's podcast is we're talking about sort of government and government activities and actions. And one of the things that certainly insiders within the industry know about, but maybe not so many people on the outside, is this thing called the CHIPS Act. And so let's just start with, what is the CHIPS Act?
So the CHIPS Act is a proposal within the US to effectively create tax breaks to allow the US to, wean itself off of foreign supply and ensure that it has a robust domestic capability and an ability to manufacture and fully supply demand around central processing units, as we would know and love, but also wider semiconductors.
And so the focus is building indigenous capabilities here, the manufacturing elements of that, but not just the silicon aspects of it. It's things like packaging, testing, basically all elements. Is that correct?
I think what we would recognize is that global supply chains are now truly global. And so we rely on, both in Europe and the US, increasingly a supply base for some of the latter parts of the production outside of, I think, what we would define as friendly territories these days. And so the aspiration is to bring all of that onshore. Primarily, the US is obviously leading the charge here, but we can see that Europe is following up and behind with similar aspirations.
Does this extend all the way to raw materials, or will those be kind of geolocated wherever they are currently?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, what we would recognize is that there is a scarcity in certain elements of the raw materials, and there is wider geopolitical activity in that space. And when we look to where the supplies are, that will be done through foreign policy. The US and Europe cannot supply necessarily all the raw materials itself. It will need to have friendly partners where those assets are located in the ground. Supposing one has secured the supply of those, this is to ensure then that we can actually produce the volume, the quality, with the chains of trust that we require now increasingly to secure that supply to support our domestic markets.
I assume you're going to say both, but let me see if I can try to tease this out a little bit. Is the idea mostly that we want to make sure that if there is any interruption in supply because of maybe geopolitical issues, a war, a natural disaster, that we can source chips here locally on US soil? Or is it more about the fact that because the world is so tied to technology, that it is in our best interest from a security standpoint that we build these things in facilities that we trust, that we know they haven't been tampered with?
It's both of those, and it's more, actually. So there's a couple of things. We have current generation computing, which I think we're all familiar with both general purpose kind of computing, but then also increasingly application-specific optimized computing. And then we can see future generations in terms of neuromorphic. There is both the kind of the supply, the security, the integrity, the ability to service demand, all of those, but there is increasingly an argument around ensuring that as we come with next generation manufacturing techniques and next generation CPU designs, that intellectual property shall we say, not used to bootstrap foreign economies where they haven't done necessarily the respective R&D investments that we have in the West historically. And so it's about maintaining economic competitive advantage as well as all of the very valid points which you raised.
Are you basically saying IP protection? Was that a part of what you said in that answer?
Sorry, yeah, it's a very succinct way of saying it. IP protection and making sure that we gain the economic advantage for the investment effort that we put into R&D.
Is the CHIPS Act formulated in such a way that there is upfront investment to pay for companies to build facilities upfront? Is there that element of it in the CHIPS Act?
No, as I understand it, it's all tax. It's tax benefit for firms to incentivize the investment for them. It's going to create, obviously, existing companies.
Is there a back-end incentive as well, meaning like a built-in demand that's going to come from the CHIPS Act?
The demand is already there. We are seeing wider activities which are precluding certain technologies manufactured from certain regions from being able to use indigenous core critical national infrastructure. And we will only expect that. And so that will ultimately continue to drive demand from trusted partners. And that's both domestic. So again, I think what you recognize is the US establishing a robust supply chain means it can service the demand from allied countries, including the UK and Australia and continental Europe.
That was very helpful, by the way, just sort of exploring what the CHIPS Act actually is. Maybe we could learn a little bit more too. Now, we don't have the CHIPS Act right now. So how do things work today? Can you describe today how things work with, say, critical infrastructure, critical components, the military, those kinds of things? What do they do today?
That varies today, if I'm being entirely transparent. So there's obviously the ability to do a degree of domestic production in the US today, but it cannot meet all of the demand. The reality is that there are some components, some CPUs, some chips, which are manufactured overseas in the likes of China and other states. Obviously Taiwan is a friendly state, but is another example. And then those are imported. Having worked for a hardware manufacturer in a former life that no longer makes smartphones. But one of the challenges that we had specifically is when we wanted to introduce key material into those devices, we had to get them shipped to one country, inject them with key material, and then ship them to manufacturing plants back into the country of origin, which obviously adds substantial costs and round trip delays and various other things. And so today, effectively, we are relying in part on that foreign supply chain.
Do you think there's risk that we kind of go backwards in this kind of philosophy of we have quote unquote perimeter security, or we're building onshore and so we understand exactly what's happening and we let down a guard, for example, and instead of realizing that vulnerabilities could be anywhere or breaches or attacks could be attempted anywhere? Or do you think this is accompanied with this greater sense of the need for like digital assurance, no matter where you're building?
It's a great question because I think, what we're seeing more broadly is balkanization of technology. We are starting to see fractures. We are starting to see countries increasingly distrust each other and a desire for sovereignty in terms of technology production. I think the rationale for this act and this aspiration actually makes quite a lot of sense. So one is it is such a critical component in that it sits at the root of trust to pretty much all software layers that then sit atop of it. So you want to ensure the integrity of that, given it is the root of that trust. And then I think, more importantly, as we are experiencing now, there are massive supply constraints, and that is holding back everything from the manufacturing of electric vehicles through to God knows whatever else. And we don't want that as we increasingly become dependent, and demand is not going to shrink. So I think, yes, an argument could be made that it's kind of quite introspective and recoiling from the globalization of the economies. But I think it's terrible sense to think of actually how important kind of the chips are to the core fabric of the security models we rely on today.
What's the mechanics of getting this thing passed? Like, where is it currently? When do we expect that it does get passed?
Well, and that's a great question. So I was reading up on this today, and where are we? So it is currently, as of, let me just double check, 2 days ago, we've got 9 governors pressing for it to be passed. So At the moment, we are in the final throes and the pressure of being applied of it being a thing in the US. So when it passes, I'm not familiar enough with how quick or slow the US legislative system will actually respond to that pressure. But there seems to be a body of weight of activity behind it for sure.
Is there any legislative action that would be required from, let's say, the UK as an example? So once the CHIPS Act passed in the US, is there anything that needs to happen in other allied countries for them to align behind the CHIPS Act, or is it kind of understood, built in?
Other countries will naturally gravitate towards a trusted supply base, and so it is true there may be follow-up legislation or regulation in those markets if they want kind of further control and supply, but it's not necessary for it to naturally happen.
I'm curious if you fast forward, let's say a year, 2, 3 in the future. So the CHIPS Act passes, and now we have this supply of local computer technology chip. How do you see that playing out within the industry and ecosystem? And to me, is what is interesting is it gets back to how do you market security? Because you can say, for example, if you bought from this particular manufacturer, this is a trusted chip. It's built in a facility that you have much higher trust with, whatever. And therefore, if you're building a car, you're building a power grid, or you're building a pipeline or whatever, boy, you really want to use these things, but these are chips that you can trust. Or you could save a few bucks maybe, and you could buy them from these other guys. It feels to me like once you have these quote unquote trusted supplies, how could you ever justify buying from an untrusted source?
I think you're spot on. Your crystal ball is very accurate. Naturally, when the supply is there and there are viable, cost-effective, unconstrained supply options, people are going to naturally start to gravitate towards those supplies to, if you're going to, because we know the kind of the digital substation is in our near future. And so highly connected substations for electricity distribution, one would be short-sighted, I think, to build off of foreign supplied core technology, I think, at that point. So you're right, that's the way that we will go. And people will just naturally kind of drift away for critical national infrastructure aspects from those foreign supply.
So then, like a follow on to that is, do we end up with more and more divergent technology around the world? So, like, as different groups in the industry are designing and optimizing around new use cases for artificial intelligence and machine learning, are we going to see more discrete solutions for those things that become more and more specific and differentiated from one another?
Yes, I think we do. And I think, there are a couple of things at play here because, we have the Open RISC V architecture, and there's a degree of momentum getting behind that. I think, and again, I touched on it, but neuromorphic computing, we can see kind of utility specific. One of the kind of poster child use cases for neuromorphic is it can't be taught machine learning or facial recognition, but it can be embedded with the ability to recognize new faces because it has a core understanding of what a face looks like. And so we're going to see increasingly utility specific at edge compute style use cases emerge. And I think that is going to lead to, outside of general purpose computing, a much more complex. And then you factor in kind of indigenous technologies from the likes of China and India. And then I think we're going to see a natural divergence from technologies emanating from those geographies where it isn't all originally Western originated.
If I've got this right, what I hear you painting is a picture of nationalistic supply. So you'll end up with, let's say at the very basic level, kind of an East versus West supply of these kind of chips. And both will try to build up their capabilities in those respective supply pools. And it will be a competition about who can build the best technology, the best chips. And barring one group just running away from the other, you'll see sort of an ecosystem building up on each side. If one side gets drastically ahead of the other, then I guess the losing geography will have to come, even though they don't like it, they're going to have to use the other guy's chips. Is that kind of how you see it?
Very much so. That competition is going to be fought on a number of levels. It'll obviously be quality, it'll be function, it'll be cost, and then obviously the supporting software. And I think, what we've recognized is that some of the activities that have happened, such as entity list kind of placement of certain firms, has accelerated some of those endeavors in order for them to become similarly domestically self-sufficient. And I think, we're seeing this somewhat played out as well in the quantum race, right? We're already seeing some of this, and everyone's racing for the prize, and whoever wins, people understand it's for proper table stakes.
You're making me think about really what is our definition of critical infrastructure. We've been talking about power grids and the kind of obvious traditional critical infrastructure, but the more you're kind of segmenting populations geographically, I'm wondering if our own consumer devices become part of our critical infrastructure because they have so much insight into just populations.
You're so spot on. Historically, we define critical national infrastructure as almost the core, the kind of the lifeblood, the kind of the big iron of the country. But I think, what we all recognize is supply chains are increasingly complex. We actually don't know often where the pinch points are. I know that my country, at least, I think the UK would struggle significantly if internet banking collapsed for any period of time, as well as the digital benefit system, as well as the track and trace app for kind of COVID management. And so you can see if we worked as a firm on the smart meter project, right, which was assessing the smart meters that were going to go into everyone's home, because actually that edge device, if they could be co-opted en masse, could absolutely wreak havoc without going anywhere near the center.
To me, it's fascinating because it starts with our conversation on the CHIPS Act, but then you start playing it forward and what's likely to happen. My understanding of the computer chip ecosystem, and it's pretty detailed, I mean, I've been in the industry for a long time, is that the majority of the R&D, the majority of the sort of expertise and everything else derived from Silicon Valley and the West more broadly, right? And the manufacturing elements, principally because of cost, moved over to Asia. And so you now have this really interesting dynamic because the R&D still is largely kind of in the West, I would say more generically, while the majority of the manufacturing is in the East. And so pulling that manufacturing over to the West, now what does the East do? They don't have a history of building the capability of invention. Playing that out, if you're in their shoes, it's very interesting. Like, what do you do? If the West now is saying that figuratively, I'm taking my ball and I'm going home, what does the East do?
They've already indicated what they will and are going to do, and it is going to build it around RISC-V. So the first indigenous, broadly speaking, comparative CPUs to probably our mid-range have started to emanate domestically based on open design. It's not as if they have to start entirely from scratch. There is a body of work out there in open source with the right licensing, which allows them to build on effectively for kind of current modern ways of doing computing. Obviously, the future's unwritten on certain other aspects, and so I think they're less encumbered with lack of domain knowledge because we're all striving to kind of do that R&D. It's a costly catch up, but it's not insurmountable. I think is probably my assessment at the moment.
This has been a really fascinating conversation, looking into the near future with the CHIPS Act, but then also the more distant future. It's really informative. So thanks for doing that. But before we let you go, we have a segment on our podcast that we like to do. We call Fun Facts. And it's just that. It's meant to have a little bit of fun, share some sometimes useless facts, sometimes more interesting. But I wonder, do you have something that you would like to share with our listeners?
I do. And so it's often cited that the original Italian Job is the first movie in which there is a hacker, where Benny Hill takes over the traffic lights in the Italian Job. And actually, that movie is beaten to the punch by a small British movie, which people never hear of, because it's only if you go digging do you get it. So the first movie in which hacking occurred was a movie called Hot Millions, which featured Peter Ustinov. Go and dig it out and see the glorious 1960s impression of modern hacking.
What did they break into? What was it?
Naturally, it was for millions. It was for money. And so it was a banking computer, which So it's still the punchline. If the light was blinking, they knew what the computer was doing. And so you can kind of work out what the plot is going to be.
Deep plot. All right. Camille, how about you?
So my fun fact is my dad is actually an artist. So the painting behind me is a sanderling that he painted. So I was looking up sanderlings, and they're these incredible little birds. They actually breed in the Arctic tundra, and then they fly anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 kilometers actually for the rest of the year. So they're one of the largest sort of migration distances species out there. And they're these tiny little things. And you'll see them, they eat invertebrates at the shoreline. So you'll see them, they kind of gather together in flocks, and they all run together, and they run out when the wave goes out, and they run up when the wave comes up, and out and up and out and up. And they're just these cute little things.
Shocking that a bird that small could travel that far. I've seen them. They're everywhere on the Oregon coast.
I always wondered where they went, and now I know it's to the Arctic Circle tundra to lay 3 or 4 eggs.
Well, my fun fact, through the magic of working remotely, last week, I actually worked for real. I did work over in Hawaii. I just woke up hellishly early, like 4 a.m., and I would do my meetings from 4 a.m. until 2 p.m. because of the magic of time zones. And that was the work day for the Pacific Coast. And then at 2 o'clock, I was free to do whatever I wanted. And then I had the weekends on either side. I went to the volcano there on the Big Island that was erupting. And so my fun fact, I had to find something interesting about volcanoes based on the fact that I just saw one for the first time in my life actually erupting. The magma coming out, lava pool. It was just fascinating. If you haven't done it, I highly, highly recommend it. It's just incredible. And you can walk relatively close. You're within maybe 400 yards or so of where the lava is coming out. So it's kind of cool. And I got great pictures even with my iPhone. But anyway, so my fun fact is that there are 18 volcanoes in the US currently with a potential to erupt again. All of those are in either Alaska, Hawaii, or the US West Coast. The tallest volcano on Earth is Hawaii's Mauna Kea. And it has an elevation of 4,207 meters. So that sounds kind of cool. If you do the, translation, whatever that is, 12,000 plus feet. However, Mauna Kea actually rises up from the bottom of the ocean. The elevation, when we calculate it, from sea level up, but it actually rises from the bottom of the ocean. So if you could measure the Mauna Kea from its base on the ocean floor to its peak, its true height would be 10,203 meters. And that, folks, is taller than Mount Everest.
That's a good fun fact. I like it.
Ollie, thank you so much for joining us today. The conversation on the CHIPS Act, it's in the news. I thought it was a great way for our listeners to learn about it. I think Camille and I both learned some stuff from it as well. So thanks for spending the time with us.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us for Cybersecurity Inside. You can follow us here on YouTube or wherever you get your audio podcasts.
The views and opinions expressed are those of the guests and author and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Intel Corporation.